Hello guys, see you again with QINIMA Sports. Charles Oliveira became the new lightweight champion in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, where he won a TKO victory in the second round over Michael Chandler at UFC 262. Their fight at that time became the main headline of UFC 262, which was held at the Toyota Center, Houston, Texas, United States. Previously, Oliveira had made his record with 8 consecutive wins in the UFC, then was able to beat the newcomer Michael Chandler in the second round. That's what made him win the lightweight championship belt and succeed Khabib Nurmagomedov's throne and carve out his 31st victory in MMA. Charles made his prestigious MMA debut in 2010, making him a veteran name. That makes him enter as one of 10 fighters from Brazil whose action is a must-watch. However, from all his achievements, it turns out that Charles Oliveira has also experienced defeat. This is a total of 8 defeats for Charles Oliveira. But before we start, make sure you press the subscribe button and activate the bell, so you don't miss other interesting info. Versus Jim Miller 1, UFC 124. Charles Oliveira vs. Jim Miller happened on December 11, 2010, at UFC 124, where Charles Oliveira was 21 years old, while Jim Miller was 27 years old. In the first round, Oliveira started with a head shot. Miller advanced with his combination. Oliveira then fired another high shot, where Miller decided to finish the fight as soon as possible. Miller then launched a double-leg takedown and brought down Oliveira, but Oliveira managed to wrap himself around the guillotine. Finally, Miller managed to escape the guillotine and managed to control the fight. Miller had time to stand, but they managed to hold the feet of each opponent. Then Miller did a knee bar lock that saw the Brazilian give up and tap as fast as he could. The result of the fight was Charles Oliveira's 5 strikes, while Jim Miller only had 1 strike, but managed to do 1 takedown and 1 submission, which ended the fight. The end of the fight was a win for Jim Miller in the first round at 1:59 seconds. Versus Donald Saron, UFC Live. Charles Oliveira vs. Donald Saron takes place at UFC Live, Hardy vs. Lytle, on August 14, 2011. Yep, despite the impressive performance that night, Donald Saron still seeks respect, and he earns it. Saron was very dominant with 30 strikes, compared to Oliveira who only struck 10. Many people think that Oliveira's young age, speed, strength and aggressiveness will lead him to victory, but the Cowboys have other plans. Saron is the bigger guy, and he's aggressive too, which is what made him land a brutal knee in the early minutes. However, his steps were stopped because of his lower kick, but finally the fight resumed. The Cowboy listened to his coach who was on the edge of the octagon, and he started throwing straighter punches and managed to land big kicks and punches. In the end, 1 big hit sent Oliveira to the mat, and the veteran launched a ground and pound action until the fight was stopped in the first round at 3:1 seconds. Donald Saron is in the top 15, but he was able to put up too much too soon resistance for Charles Oliveira. Versus Cub Swanson, UFC 152. Charles Oliveira vs. Cub Swanson takes place on September 22, 2012, at UFC 152, with the Jones vs. Belfort. After back-to-back defeats against Jim Miller and Donald Saron, Oliveira learned so much that she was able to beat Eric Wisely and Jonathan Brookins. On the other hand, Swanson has improved tremendously as a skilled mid-level talent, especially with his striking. Yet, this is about 2 of the fastest rising UFC featherweights will meet in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Cub Swanson tested reach early by landing a good footed shot and left hook before Oliveira made a takedown. But Swanson immediately stood up and then continued the fight until finally Swanson managed to land a heavy left punch and right hook into Oliveira's face. Oliveira then retreated for a moment, then fell with a delayed reaction, then was silent for some time until the referee finally stopped the fight in the first round at 2:40 seconds. Technical knockout winning result for Cub Swanson. Versus Frankie Edgar, UFC 162. UFC 162 presents the main card. Anderson Silva vs Chris Weidman took place in Las Vegas, Nevada, on July 6, 2013. Of course, it was an event that many people had been waiting for, not least for the two talented, wild and hungry featherweight fighters. Yup, Charles Oliveira vs Frankie Edgar, the former UFC lightweight belt holder who is fighting for the second time. On the other hand, Charles Oliveira was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt holder under Jorge Patino. This is a major test for the Du Bronx at UFC featherweight, who will measure himself against Frankie Edgar in Las Vegas. Back then, Du Bronx, Charles Oliveira, had 8 fights in the UFC, with 4 wins, 3 losses and 1 no contest. However, if she can beat former UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar, Oliveira will rise to the next level in this category. Unfortunately, Oliveira's 38 strikes and 1 submission have not been able to beat Frankie Edgar's 81 strikes and 2 takedowns. The fight was finally won by Frankie Edgar, with the judge's decision from a total of 3 fight rounds. Versus Max Holloway 1, UFC Night Fight. After 13 fights in the UFC, Charles Oliveira finally has his own main card event when he meets Max Holloway. Of course, this event is highly anticipated by everyone, including Oliveira and Max Holloway. In their last fight, Holloway had a huge success with a win against Cub Swanson, while Oliveira had just knocked out Nick Lentz in his last fight. Meanwhile, Oliveira was clearly focused on moving her head and closing the distance. But unfortunately, the fight ends before we see who is the greatest fighter between the two. Oliveira notices her injury and admits that the fight is over to Herb Dean. This is very annoying for everyone because this main event should be interesting, where 2 of the world's best young fighters prove themselves, but have to end before one of them can prove it. While Max Holloway came out victorious, on the other hand, Oliveira was very disappointed and had to heal herself to prepare for the next fight. Versus Anthony Pettis, UFC in Fox. That evening, former UFC lightweight champion and WEC lightweight title holder, Anthony Pettis, will take on 7th-ranked challenger Charles Oliveira. They met at UFC on Fox, with Maya vs. Condit, on August 27, 2016, in Houston, Texas, United States. Pettis is a dynamic fighter and is known for his striking play that is creative and varied. Having lost his title in 3 straight defeats, Pettis is really preparing for this fight, and there is no other choice but to make his own place in MMA. On the other hand, Oliveira is an aggressive Muay Thai striker with submission skills that cannot be underestimated. Even Oliveira has repatriated prominent fighters such as Miles Jury, Nick Lentz, and Jonathan Brookins. Armed with 5 previous victories, Oliveira wants to use Pettis as a stepping stone to the race for the featherweight title. In the fight, Anthony Pettis finally managed to stop Charles Oliveira via a guillotine choke submission in the 3rd round at 1:49 seconds. Anthony Pettis had 53 strikes and 1 submission that stopped Oliveira. Meanwhile, Oliveira did quite well with 41 strikes and 4 takedowns made to Pettis. Versus Richardo Lamas, UFC Night Fight. They fought in UFC Fight Night 98, with the main card Dos Anjos vs Ferguson, on November 5, 2016, at the Mexico City Arena. Lamas has been consistently in the top 5 featherweight for several years then. Oliveira is in 8th position, while Lamas is in 4th position in the featherweight division. Although he is not the most skilled, but the comprehensive ability and opportunistic attacks is a dangerous combination of llamas. Meanwhile, Oliveira was overweight, so had to undergo a tremendous cut. Oliveira had to lose as much as 4 kilograms a few hours before the scheduled featherweight contest against Lamas. Despite the incredible cuts, Lamas refused to cancel the match and insisted on continuing. But after a good fight from both fighters, Lamas managed to wrap a tight guillotine that stopped Oliveira's resistance. The fight ended in the second round at 2:13 seconds with a win for Ricardo Lamas via a guillotine choke submission. Versus Paul Felder, UFC 218. After 2 consecutive defeats against Anthony Pettis and Ricardo Lamas, Oliveira managed to win the match against Will Brooks at UFC 210. Now, all Oliveira needs is to maintain his victory when he meets Paul Felder in the lightweight match at UFC 128. Meanwhile, Felder went into consecutive nights to win the performance of the night bonus fight when he managed to fight Alessandro Ricci and Stevie Ray. Finally, Felder managed to use ground and pound and managed to land a hard elbow until the referee waved to stop the fight. The victory was won by Felder in the second round, minute 4:06 seconds technical knockout. Well guys, that's a total of 8 defeats to do Bronx, Charles Oliveira da Silva, in his MMA career. Do you think Charles Oliveira will be able to defend his title later, against the challenger Islam Makhachev? Tell your opinion in the comments column. Don't forget to like and share. See you in another video. See ya.